Now, the Ministry of Education this week said that it would not regulate tuition fees in schools across the country. Do you think this is justifiable?
I think that, first of all, I was very shocked, and I believe that many people were shocked by that statement, because when you look at our Constitution, under Objective 18, National Objectives and Directive Principles of State Policy, individuals, non-government organizations, and religious bodies are allowed to start schools. We have schools that are owned by government, the public schools and the government-aided schools. So in ministry coming up with that statement, it presupposes that by providing free education, that those schools are not going to charge fees. But we know they have been charging fees, even with the presence of universal primary education, but also universal secondary education. So, but also we have to understand that under Section 3 and 57 of the Education Act, the minister has a responsibility from time to time to issue instruments or regulations to regulate school fees in all schools in the country. That one is under Education Act. The minister is supposed to do so. So in the ministry coming up that they are not going to regulate fees, I think that is going against our law. But also we have to understand that as a country, there are schools that receive state funds, public funds. And for instance, these are government-aided schools. We call them government-aided schools. Yonabisunsas, Gayaza, King's College, Budo, such schools. They receive government support in terms of having their teachers on payroll, government payroll. They receive infrastructure support in terms of classrooms, laboratories, and libraries, and other things. So there is taxpayers' money going into those schools. So government cannot say, Ministry of Education cannot say that they are not going to regulate school fees.
Some would argue that the ministry still has a choice to decide whether to regulate fees or not. Don't you agree?
They don't have a choice. This is a question of the law. It is a question of the law. That the Education Act says from time to time, the minister should be able to do this. It is provided for under the law. So we should be following the law. So they don't have a choice. It is something that they have to do. And maybe just to give you an example, in the 1980s, 1980 and 1981, if you go online, you can see the Obote government issued statutory instruments regulating fees, and they had categories, and they would say for a school in the urban area, for a school in the rural area, if it is boarding or it is primary, they were providing that guidance that this is the amount of money that has to be paid. It has happened before, and we have it in our law. It is not a mistake that it is in the Education Act.
So some still would argue that if those parents that are actually aggrieved by, you know, the fact that some schools that their children are going to are charging high tuition, should go to schools that they can afford.
I think it is misguided, I should say. Education, healthcare, these are rights. And that can only happen in an incidence where you're talking about a private school, a purely private school. But if it is a school that is receiving government funds, that is receiving taxpayers' money, and even some of these schools are beneficiaries of loans that Ugandans are paying, that cannot arise. So education is not something that you subject to market forces. So government has to be in charge. So if a school is receiving state funds, any child should be able to get into that school, as long as it is receiving state funds. If it is a private school, it is okay. Go there only if you can afford. But if it is government, I think government should have a hand in that. So it shouldn't be about ability to pay. No. Yes.
But you see, these schools still argue that the fee structure is mostly incorporated, mostly by the cost of living, which includes, you know, paying the staff, the welfare of the children at school.
But us being Ugandans and living in this country and understanding the education sector, we also know that there are government schools, government-aided schools, that are charging even more highly than the purely private, which are of the same standard. And why is that so? That a government-aided school, that is, whose teachers, majority are on government payroll, who has already the infrastructure, has to charge the same fees as a purely private, probably where even the owner got a loan to construct and has to pay all the teachers and has to meet all the costs. I think that is the point of contention. And maybe just to mention that, in talking about regulation of fees, I think it is going to be very difficult for government to say they are regulating fees for all schools, public, government-aided, and private. I think government has to start with the government-aided schools first. And when they regulate the government-aided school, where state money is going, then they can use that as a benchmark to go for the private. But they cannot just say that they are doing it at once. So government has to clean house, because how do you explain that? I don't want to mention schools here because I don't want to be campaigning for schools. But we purely know that they are government-aided schools. The Nabisonsas, the Gayazas. I went to Nabisonsa Girls, but I don't feel that many children are able to go to Nabisonsa Girls now. It is about ability to pay. But is the fees charged in Nabisonsa Girls different from what is charged in Seta High or Chitende SS? These are purely private schools, but these are schools, our contention is that there is state money, they are public funds, taxpayers' money that is going into these schools. But at the moment, they have been reserved for a certain class.
Now, previously, the ministry has made attempts to regulate school fees through issuance of guidelines and circulars. Do you think these have actually yielded any results, or have these been effective?
They have been largely ignored at best. And the reason why they are ignored is because there is no binding force. And that is why we are saying that when you have a legal instrument, when the minister issues a legal instrument, there are sanctions to that. Otherwise, you get up to the permanent secretary, Ministry of Education, writes a circular. They are simply ignored. It has been happening. They have been issuing these circulars, but they are not yielding result because they are not binding. But when we have legal instruments, the sanctions will be there.
So what is the likely impact of the ministry not regulating school fees for both primary and secondary schools?
The impact is huge, and I will tell you, and I will use government statistics. The latest report by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics says that 6 out of 10 people that drop out of school, it is because of cost. Uganda Bureau of Statistics. 6 out of 10 Ugandans who drop out of school, it is because of cost. The global education monitoring report that was published by UNICEF in 2022 spotlights Uganda as one of the countries where 30% of parents have to borrow to pay fees. When you look at that picture, and of course you know when you look at those figures, the figures could be more. Mildred, you are Ugandan. I believe you have people who will call you, even your peers. My daughter is sitting PLE. Please help me with 500,000. You have family members who will call you. That is all private debt, debt which is not even captured. So when we talk about 30%, when we talk about 6 out of 10, you know, those figures could actually be higher, much higher. So we have people getting into private debt because of school fees. Parents are borrowing to pay school fees, and such a thing should not be happening. But also, we realized that when we had COVID and our schools were reopened after 2 years, even NTV covered the stories. There was exodus of children from private schools to public schools because people's incomes had been affected. Their livelihoods had been affected. They were running to public schools, and those public schools were struggling with infrastructure. They could not cope with the numbers. What are we saying? As government, you're saying this is the state. Expand the infrastructure. Set up schools in areas where there are no schools. It is okay for the private to exist. People can set up schools. It's provided for in our constitution. The private can. Let people go to the private if they can afford it. But let us have the public system sorted out. Let us have, at least for basic education. Eh? You know that basic education is an immediate obligation of the state. Even under international human rights law, it's an immediate obligation. Eh? Basic, we are talking about primary, we are talking about secondary. Can we have that fixed? And then progressively, we can look at higher education.
If you had to advise the government on this matter, how would you wish the government to approach this issue?
The issue about regulation, we are saying that go slow, start in-house. First leave the private, start with the public schools, the government-aided schools, because if you don't regulate your own schools, where you're putting government money, the private is not going to listen to you. Sort out the school fees structure in Nabisonsa, sort out the fees structure in Gayaza, sort out the fee structure in Namiriango. And then you use that as a benchmark to go to the private, but in-house, start in-house, where your money is going. We have economists, we have a whole national planning authority here. And actually the National Planning Authority has provided government guidance that this is how much it should cost for you to educate a child. Can we look at those figures and look within our budgets and see how we can progressively reach that milestone? But when government says that they are not going to regulate, it's going to be free, it's going to be the same story. People are going to charge, and what is going to be the effect? Children are dropping out of school, and you have children going into child labor because they are not into school. You're getting other problems. You're getting early pregnancies, teenage pregnancies. Just when government closed school for 2 years during COVID, the numbers skyrocketed for teenage pregnancy. But sorting our education system solves many problems. Eh? You're sorting, children will not get pregnant because they are in school, they are occupied. Children will not go into child labor. But now, because the fees is so high and parents have to make a choice, it will be very easy, like go and work, supplement home income. But we know that we need an educated workforce for it to make sense.
So as we conclude this conversation, if you had to advise a parent who has just received a notification from his or her child's school that the school fees for third term has been raised, what would you tell them as we conclude?
This is something that we have been talking about, that we need to reclaim our public services. And part of that reclaiming public services, education, healthcare, because this is not only in education, it's also healthcare, is that we need an active citizenry. Citizens have to be active in making these demands. If you have a school in your neighborhood where a child goes and these things are happening, because everyone charges the way they want, you'll get a notification that the fees, no consultation at all. So I think parents have to be involved in the running of the schools. There are avenues through which they can participate in the running of the schools.
Because they're key stakeholders.
Yes, they are key stakeholders. Have these negotiations, engage the different local governments and be able to demand, engage in budgeting. Our budgeting is a participatory process, but people don't engage in those processes. So they have to be active and engage in these issues, because it's not just an issue of government. It is us. The demand side has to be strengthened. They have to demand, because Uganda is a rich country. You know how much money is lost in corruption here in Uganda, all the stories you hear every day. We cannot argue that we don't have money to put in these schools, to pay teachers, to build classrooms, to have sanitary toilets. We have that money, but we just have to be active as citizens and make sure that we demand what is due to us. We need to reclaim public services.
All right, Angela, thank you for making time to speak to us. And that conversation takes us in for a short break, but NTV Weekend Edition continues shortly.